administrations in the Department of Justice and the State Department. Ambassador Bolton was ambassador for the United Nations to the UN, and he served as National Security Advisor to Donald J. Trump. So thank you for your time, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Ambassador, first question, I would like to start with a quote from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. He was saying a few days ago that the war in Ukraine is not so much about Ukraine, or not only about Ukraine, but it's about a new world order and the way the new world order would look like in the future. Is he right? Is it about the new world order?
Well, we'll have to see. Certainly the Russians have a very different view of how they'd like to see the world arranged, and I think they, for many years, have seen in Europe a zero-sum proposition between NATO and Russia. A stronger NATO is a weaker Russia in their mind. Now, it didn't have to be that way after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but that's the way they have seen it increasingly in recent years. And they're certainly acting that way in Ukraine. I do think there are much larger implications, though, for Europe and America beyond the Ukraine war, and that is the increasing closeness of the relationship between Russia and China, which I think has implications worldwide.
So what would be the implications?
Well, it's the reverse of Cold War days when the Soviet Union was the senior partner in that relationship. But I think because of a lot of common interest, Russia is an oil and gas exporter. China is a huge energy negative country, so it's a big importer. China has long bought sophisticated weapon systems from Russia and the Soviet Union before that. So I think that as they look at the world around them, they see a lot in common, and that explains their growing closeness, which obviously affects our interest worldwide.
So we are now almost 4 weeks into the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians. From your perspective, what went wrong in the first place, and could we have avoided this invasion?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of self-congratulation about Allied unity, a lot of patting ourselves on the back for strong sanctions against Russia. But let's face it, right now we are 4 weeks into an Allied failure here. We failed to deter Russia from the invasion. I think President Biden made a big mistake in early December by simply taking the possibility of American force off the table. He didn't get anything for it. It was an unforced error. He simply could have said all options are on the table and let Putin worry about where the ambiguity might lie. And the sanctions we proposed were all after the invasion would take place and were seen as weak. The time to have stopped this catastrophe was before the invasion, and we failed. Let's face it, we do not have Allied unity on the subject of Russian energy supplies. And as long as that continues, Putin's still making money off this war.
So what was the strategic mistake by telling Putin what kind of sanctions might be on the table and what might not be on the table?
Well, I think what we should have done was start sanctioning Putin before he invaded. People say, but my goodness, if we had done that, he would have invaded. Really? So what difference would it have made?
So how do you see Germany's role in all that?
Well, I think there have been some developments that one can only say are positive, that after a long period of not making progress toward meeting the 2014 commitment that all NATO members made to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, Chancellor Scholz did commit to the commitment again. That's good. Even more important, it was his announcement that he was going to buy F-35s. And I think that's a substantial step toward fixing the German military, where the planes don't fly, the ships don't sail, and the tanks don't drive. Look, we've all got a lot of work to do, and it's not just on the continent of Europe. And I think this is the real question for America and for Europe alike, whether we're going to recognize that we didn't reach the end of history when the Soviet Union collapsed. The rest of the world still feels very threatened by aggressive states like China, and that if we're going to defend ourselves and our way of life, we have to start thinking about how to do that now. The Ukraine tragedy, I think, makes that point for us.
So what does this war in Ukraine now mean for the future of Europe and the world order, as we talked about in the beginning?
Well, I think the first thing it shows is there is no rules-based international order. This was an unprovoked aggression. There's absolutely no reason for it. You say, well, gee, didn't the Russians get the memo about the rules-based international order? What it shows is you cannot live in fantasy land. There are still hard men in the world. They live in the Kremlin. They live in the Forbidden City in Beijing. They're prepared to use force to achieve their objectives. And you can talk about prosecutions for war crimes all you want at this point. It's not going to dissuade them. It hasn't dissuaded them so far. So the question for us is, will we respond? Will we take the steps necessary to be strong enough to achieve peace?
But what can we do? So Ukraine, a big city like Mariupol, seems to be flattened. Other might follow. We have 10 million Ukrainians displaced and fleeing. Can sanctions alone stop Putin?
I don't think so, although certainly we could do a lot better. We should drive a stake through the heart of Russia's energy sector. Germany doesn't look like it's willing to do that. I understand that's a problem, but how much do you care about stopping the slaughter of Ukrainians and the destruction of their cities? We should provide the Polish MiGs and any other MiGs we have in NATO arsenals to the Ukrainians. We should do much more, I think, in terms of aiding them through various kinds of assistance. I think the irony here is we failed to deter Putin, and Putin's now deterring us.
Can you imagine a scenario where NATO troops or single NATO countries engage directly in Ukraine?
Well, I think we should consider a humanitarian no-fly zone, certainly in the western part of the country. If you believe that if one American soldier looks cross-eyed at one Russian soldier and we're suddenly in World War III, then Putin's getting what he wants for free. This is a dangerous situation. There's no doubt about it. The calculations are very difficult. But if the immediate response is, oh no, we're not going to do that, my goodness, it might upset Vladimir Putin, he wins by threat alone. And that's not going to save Ukraine.
So a lot of people in Europe are afraid that we might be on the way to start World War III, and they are afraid of a nuclear attack by the Russians. You think this is a realistic view?
Well, everybody's afraid of World War III. Everybody's afraid of a nuclear attack. The question is, how do you preserve the peace and preserve our interests as well? And I think we did that during the Cold War by having effective deterrence capabilities. It's nothing new in the world. The ancient Romans said, si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. I don't think Europe, if I may say so, with all due respect, paid any attention to that for the past 30 years. Certainly many countries didn't. Now we're paying the price for it. Maybe the Ukraine tragedy has turned it around. I hope so.
So how much should we be concerned about China aiding Russia? They just said they won't deliver weapons to the Russians, but can we trust them?
I don't trust anything either one of them say at this point. I think certainly they have, at this stage, an entente, a series of understandings. I don't think they have a full-up alliance yet, but I think China has Russia's back in the Ukraine conflict in many ways. I suspect that Chinese financial institutions will provide conduits for sanctioned Russian financial institutions to do their business in international markets. I have no doubt China would be willing to backstop Russia in terms of additional purchases of oil and natural gas. It makes a lot of sense for China to get those commodities through pipelines crossing the Russian-Chinese border rather than loading them on ships in the Persian Gulf. And I suspect that there are many ways that China can provide military aid to Russia without necessarily shipping weapons back across the border.
How long can we look at Ukraine, see all the disaster happening, all the atrocities happening without doing anything?
Well, I'm worried as long as President Biden and other NATO allies say there's no possible use of military forces, we won't have a no-fly zone, we won't transfer the MiGs to Ukraine. It's a race for time. Can we get weapons in before the Russians attrit Ukraine's capabilities? Or will the Russians succeed in bringing in more forces and more supplies and grind down the Ukrainian military? Russia's a bigger country, it's got many more assets. If this just goes on and on, I think the sheer arithmetic says Russia prevails. And what would be left of Ukraine, I think, really would approach World War II levels of destruction.
So, in your book, The Room Where It Happened, you described the NATO meeting in Brussels 2018, where you were the national security advisor of Donald J. Trump. How close did Trump come to withdraw from NATO?
Well, I think all of us who were there with him really thought that we were right on the verge of him actually announcing it. And we worked hard to try and prevent that. Obviously, he didn't. I think he put his foot over the line and certainly implied that he would. It left us all worried about whether this might happen again in the future. Whether, for example, if Trump had won a second term as president, in his second term, he might have withdrawn. I think if there's a silver lining in the Ukraine tragedy, it's that in the United States, this isolationist tendency, certainly within the Republican Party, has suffered severe reverses, and I certainly hope they're permanent.
What will happen if he will be reelected? Do you think this is a real perspective here?
No, I don't think he's going to run in 2024. I think deep inside he knows he lost in 2020. He'll never admit that publicly, of course. But he knows it, and he's afraid he would lose in 2024, even if he got the Republican nomination, which I think is becoming more and more doubtful anyway. So because Trump hates being called a loser more than anything else, I think he will find some way not to run. He'll talk about running incessantly until the last possible moment. Then I think he'll try and be the kingmaker for the Republican nomination, but I don't think he's going to run.
Any prediction how this war might end and how the world will look afterwards?
Well, I'm very worried that that it may not end for a long time, that the grinding effect of the war will have a even more catastrophic impact on Ukraine. UN estimates at the moment are that more than 10 million Ukrainians have left their homes, either as internally displaced or as refugees across international borders. If the war continues, that number can only grow. And this is a tragedy that will take a long, long time to recover from. I don't see what Putin is willing to concede at the moment. And honestly, I don't see what Zelensky is willing to concede either. Not that he should, frankly, but the prospect that you derive from that is longer and longer war.
Do we have to act fast now?
Well, I think we've got to get these weapons. A lot of people have promised weapons. They have to get in and get to the front lines where the Ukrainians can use them effectively as soon as possible, because if Russia does succeed in bringing in more troops and more assets, then the balance of power will shift in their favor. NATO-supplied weapons might hold that up. Stricter sanctions, rigorously enforced, might be useful, but none of this happens in the near term.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you for having me.